I once read that W.C. Fields said, never work with children or animals because it only makes you look bad. My corollary to that is never go on after Gary Francione. And my second corollary is never go on opposite Gary Francione because he's apparently talking upstairs right now. Please don't leave the room.
Why did you tell them that?
Say what?
Why did you tell them that?
I shouldn't have, that's exactly right. I kind of walked right into that one. So, when Bob asked me to speak here, I told him I had a couple of ideas, and one of them was, it just kind of came out of my mouth, 10 mistakes people make about what it means to be vegan. And I thought, well, there's got to be 10, right? And then I was spending a lot of time trying to think of what these 10 would be. Was it 9 or was it 11? And I came up with the following 10. And I'll just talk you through them. Number one is, and they're in no particular order, except that the last one I think is in a sense the most important one. Number one is the idea that veganism is a lifestyle choice rather than a strict ethical duty. And I'm in complete agreement with Gary Francione that this is a misunderstanding. Now, I think for many people, veganism is a lifestyle choice. And to say that it's a lifestyle choice means, well, you could do it or you could not do it. It's kind of a matter of personal opinion, like whether you want to wear nail polish or not. And I think that the way I think about this in my own work is that there are sort of 3 different sorts of levels in which people tend to approach life choices. There are human health and welfare questions or concerns, there are environmental concerns, and there are animal rights concerns. And these fit together in some ways, they're in conflict with each other in some ways. But my own thinking about this is very much united with Gary's in the sense that I think the message that I personally want to get across to people is, if you want to be a vegan for health, I think that's a great thing. I think it's very important, and I'm much healthier than I would be if I hadn't been a vegan for the last 20 years. But the thing that's most pressing and most important to me is my concern for animals who are very, very vulnerable in this world and are unable to speak on their own behalf. And that I really, at bottom, think veganism needs to be understood as more than a lifestyle choice and more than something I do to make my body healthy. It's something I do for the sake of some other being that can't protect itself. Number 2 is a misunderstanding that, and I've seen philosophers argue this, that universal veganism would be environmentally catastrophic. There's a philosopher named J. Baird Caldecott who wrote this, that it would be environmentally catastrophic. And if you start, I've done a little research on this. I'm not an agronomist and I'm not an economist and so forth, but I've done enough work on this to get to the bottom of this, and it seems that that is colossally misguided misunderstanding of what would happen if there were universal veganism. When you start reading about how many resources are consumed to produce, say, beef, a standard kind of statistic is it takes 2,500 gallons of water, and it takes upwards of 7 pounds of grain to feed to a cow to produce 1 pound of beef. And so if you start to imagine all of the arable land that gets used for grazing, I've read somewhere that half of the arable land in North America is used as grazing land, and that reduces species biodiversity, it increases soil erosion, the emission of methane into the atmosphere and so forth. It seems that, and as Gary quoted earlier, and I mentioned this yesterday, the United Nations says that over 50 billion land animals are killed and consumed every year by human beings. That's a lot of animals. I mean, that's like 7 or 8 times the world's population, and that's every single year. So if you start to do the arithmetic, it starts to seem, at the very least, implausible that it would be environmentally catastrophic, and one might start to ask oneself the question, what motivates people to say it would be environmentally catastrophic to make everybody vegan? That's what we're thinking about. Number 3, that you can't be healthy as a vegan. And I would offer as empirical refutation of that everybody sitting in this room, or all the people who are vegans. I mean, there's a lot of very healthy, very robust, and dare I say it, very attractive vegans in this room. And
thank you.
There's just one. Right back at you. So I think that is misguided. And the talk that was given yesterday by a person I believe is a nutritionist really put the lie to a lot of misconceptions about the protein question, the nutrient question, and so forth. Number 4, and there are different versions of this. A vegan who has a pet is a hypocrite. And I've encountered this in my own work, being called a hypocrite on all sorts of grounds. And when Gary Francine tells you that he and Anna have 6 dogs, and I have a rescue cat, and my students ask me this all the time: if you're a vegan and you think that things like domestication are bad, why do you have a pet? And the answer is, well, there are all these needy animals that we've created, or allowed to be created. They need to be cared for. What are we supposed to do? Turn them loose and neglect them? I mean, I think the idea is we don't want to perpetuate this regime of things like pet ownership. But the animals who exist and are dependent entirely upon us, they need to be protected, they need to be cared for, they need to be loved. And that's what it means to be a vegan who has a pet. And the bottom line of that one is always get your pet animals, like Gary does, from the side of the road, or from, make sure you're getting a rescue animal. Number 5, and Gary alluded to this when he was quoting Peter Singer. The Peter Singer view about veganism or even vegetarianism is that you can be flexible. And I've heard the expression used on behalf of Peter Singer that he's a flexitarian. And I happen to, another way that you see this is when people define, Mike, where's Mike? We were just talking about, the thing that I was thinking of when you and I were talking just now is when people define themselves as a vegetarian or vegan and go on to explain that what they mean by that is, and you may have heard this before too, I don't eat red meat at home. That's their definition of being a vegetarian or a vegan. It's a kind of curious, philosophically interesting suggestion. I happen to agree with Gary that the idea of a flexitarian just doesn't make any sense, and I tend to think of being a flexitarian. I think the better word is slackitarian. Number 6, that there's no such thing as a vegan, and there's actually a web page with this title. Have any of you seen it? There's no such thing as a vegetarian or vegan. I think it says no such thing as a vegan, and what it is it's got a drawing of a cow and a bunch of arrows pointing at different parts of the cow and an extraordinarily long list of products and processes that involve animals, and things like, not just food, but things like adhesives, paints, computers, and mattresses, and all sorts of things. And the bottom line there is it suggests that the idea of being a vegan is just fanciful and unrealistic, because animals are used so extensively and so pervasively by human beings that it's impossible to be a vegan. This, I think, is a misunderstanding of what it means to be a vegan, and I think the end of Gary's talk kind of pinpoints what it means to be vegan. I think it's a mistake to approach the definition of being a vegan by thinking in terms of it's about food, or it's about clothing, or it's about mattresses or computers. It is about those things, but more fundamentally, it's about nonviolence. It's about caring for sentient life, and it's about seeing yourself, in the eyes of another sentient being that happens not to have a body exactly like yours. And I think when Gary talks about how, veganism is part of a larger concern for all sorts of discrimination, I think he's really right that, when I look in the eyes of a person of a different sex, or of a different race, or a different ethnicity, or a different cultural orientation, or a different type of sentient embodiment, I'm looking in some sense at myself. And for me, that's really kind of a bottom line here, that's what being a vegan is ultimately really all about. And the way I sort of framed this in my last book is that veganism is a kind of ideal that we strive toward. It's not like a light switch where either you're a vegan and you're not involved in animal products and processes whatsoever, or you're a non-vegan. Being a vegan means that every day you try to reduce a little bit more the violence that you inflict and that our culture inflicts on animals. Number 7. Actually, I just rolled 6 and 7 together. 7 was that veganism is simply about food, about clothing, and so forth. I'll just skip straight to 8. That vegans have no right to impose their views on others. So for example, I'll give you an example of this. People sometimes, perhaps quite often, say, eating meat is deeply rooted in my cultural heritage. Or eating meat is part of my religious tradition. This is a really sensitive one, and I think one has to tread very, very carefully here because, just as I don't think it makes sense to kill vivisectors, I don't think it's good to kill anybody. I think one has to always be respectful about these sorts of things while still saying, look, there are all kinds of cultural commitments that have the form of prejudices that to a very large extent are arbitrary. And that we have to have the courage and also the patience and the respect to be willing to step back from our own cultural commitments and from other people's cultural commitments and be willing to subject them to cultural or critical scrutiny. I'm not sure it's a good idea to use the idea that this is part of my cultural tradition as a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card. Because all kinds of, and again, this is something else that I actually have a few ideas of my own, but these dovetail so much with Gary's that they sometimes seem, indistinguishable from each other. That there are all sorts of things that are done in the name of some kind of cultural heritage or cultural tradition. Cockfighting in Bali is one of them that Clifford Geertz wrote a very famous essay about. And eating animals, husbanding animals, owning slaves. There's justification for that in the Bible. And I think, one has to walk a very fine line here, but there has to be some way of appealing to the better angels of the nature of somebody who says, I come from a culture in which people eat meat. I have relatives who say that to me. There's got to be a way of getting people to step out of that and think, I wonder if this is a kind of self-serving prejudice, just to call it a cultural tradition. Number 9, the suggestion that vegans care more for some animals than for other animals. This is one that I get sometimes, and you may have as well. For example, that I care more about cows than I do about, say, the snakes and the weevils and the mice and so forth that are killed by combines in fields that are harvesting grain. And I think this is a real misunderstanding of what it means to be vegan because, as Gary likes to say, all death is really lamentable and deplorable. And I don't think that anybody who really stops and thinks about how animals are killed by combines is gonna feel sanguine about it. I think, the way I tend to look at this is in the following way. Maybe the problem is large-scale, agribusiness more than the problem of actually harvesting grain. And I tend to be, look, I'm a philosopher, I don't know much about actual reality, but the way I tend to think about this is, if we could design and build and deploy a Voyager spacecraft years and years ago that finally made it out of the solar system, there's gotta be a way to address a problem like that. It's not the case that we care more about, or that we ought to care more about animals that are more like us, or animals that are larger, or anything like that. And people say, well, what about insects? And I think that's a real serious question that we should be thinking about. Are insects sentient beings? And I've tried to do some research on this, and it's very hard to find any kind of hard information on this. Scientists are just kind of throw their hands up and are really uncertain. And I've read mixed things, and you can't interview invertebrates because they tend not to cooperate with the inventory of questions that you have. And they're so different than us morphologically in terms of the structure of their anatomy and so forth that it's just very hard to know what is going on there. The fact that ants and bees do lots of things in very rote, unconscious, automatic ways doesn't really solve the question or answer the question, because human beings do lots of things in automatic, rote ways as well, and that doesn't mean that we're not sentient. I think the real concern is that to the extent that a being might be sentient, we better be seriously concerned about it and then think about how we can try to reduce the violence that we inflict even on invertebrate life. And then there's the last one, number 10. which is, this is the one I said I think is probably the most pressing and central of my concerns about mistakes that people make about what it means to be vegan. I call it the moral high ground criticism, which is that vegans are moralizing, judgmental, finger-wagging, finger-pointing individuals. And I don't think that vegans can, I don't know, I can only speak for myself. I don't think of myself in that way at all. And I think the idea is, it's kind of like saying that anybody who says that rape is bad is being judgmental and on the moral high ground and finger wagging. I think somebody, I don't know what or that, that child abuse or that, sex trafficking, when you say that something like that is wrong, like suddenly you're on the moral high ground, all you're doing is saying, this is a horrible, I don't want to live in a world that has this. That's the difference, right? I gave a talk at the Messerly Research Institute at the University of Vienna a couple of years ago, and the professor who invited me, his name is Hervé Grimm, and he's a philosopher at that institute, and he asked me the question, he says, when you see people doing things to animals that you think are morally wrong, does it make you angry at them? And I said, no, it makes me sad. And I think that's the difference. It makes me really sad that we live in a world where these things happen and where people don't really stop and think about what they're doing. Another way that people make the moral high ground criticism, and this is a little bit more sort of philosophically rich, is there's a French philosopher named Dominique Listel. And he's about my age, and he's written a lot of very interesting books, and he's more or less an animal rights kind of person. But he wrote a book a couple of years ago that I actually took it on myself to translate into English, and Columbia University Press is going to be publishing it later this year under the title, Eat This Book, A Meat Eater's Manifesto. And you might be wondering, why would somebody like me translate a book like this? And there's a number of reasons for it, but one of the reasons is it was really in the spirit of trying to do my damnedest to retain an open mind about opposing viewpoints, because in academic philosophy it's very scrappy and pugilistic, and people shout each other down and don't listen to each other. And part of it was a gesture to say, okay, look, if you believe that animal rights is consistent with meat eating, let me expose everybody in this room to this argument, who, if you can't read the French, say, and you can judge for yourself. And Listel's argument is the following. It's kind of interesting, and it goes like this. So people like me say that this anthropocentric problem that I discussed yesterday is a sign of what's called human exceptionalism. Human exceptionalism is the idea that human beings are special and superior to all other beings in the world, and that we have the prerogative to do whatever we want to everything else. That's what human exceptionalism is, and Listel says in this book, the real exceptionalists are the vegetarians and the vegans, the ethical ones, because we think that we can rise above the eternal cycles of predation in nature, and that we think that we're better than the rest of the world, when in fact what we really need to do is recognize what Listel calls the infinite debt that we have to the living, that we cannot live except by dint of the death of other living things, be they plants or animals, that we have what he calls a metabolic relationship to the living. And that we're trying to forget this. We vegans and vegetarians are trying to forget this by pretending that we can eliminate or rise above the eternal cycles of predation. And he thinks that's his version of the moral high ground argument that he lodges against the ethical vegetarian or the vegan. And what he says is that what we really need to do is that in order to remind ourselves of the infinite debt that we have to the living, we should engage in limited ritual consumption of meat, because that will remind us of the sort of horrible kind of entanglement of life and death in which we're involved. And I think I list this as one version of the 10th mistake about what it means to be vegan, because my own sort of common sense, simplistic thinking is, I'm living in a world that has an extraordinary amount of violence. Do I really need to eat meat to be reminded of it? That's just why I'm thinking about this. So so the bottom line of all of this, these 10 mistakes about what it means to be vegan is, I think that we can take them as these mistakes as a kind of diagnosis of how people perceive what it means to be vegan, people who are non-vegans. And I got in trouble for saying this when I wrote this in an op-ed piece for the New York Times the Sunday before Thanksgiving in 2009. What the hell, it's out there, so I'll say it again. I think these sorts of criticisms and mistakes that people make come from a place of, a bit of defensiveness and fear about maybe the values of a culture that tries to justify the subjection of animals. The reaction to that, or the response to that, is not to engage in moralizing or finger-pointing. It's, I think, to use the same sense of caring and compassion toward our fellow human beings who maybe aren't in tune with this message of veganism, just as we want to respond to non-human animals with caring and compassion. And that, I think, is the bottom line. That's about all I prepared to say. I don't know what the time is, or if there's time for any questions or comments, or I can just quietly go away. Yeah.
It's a comment. I think people, what they say about us, about vegans.
So you're identifying yourself as a vegan?
Yeah. Well, I'm trying. I'm going to become.
Can I just, before you continue, can I just ask you what has motivated you to do that?
Well, what has motivated me to become a vegan is that I live close. This is what my family and I live close to Farmer John, and most of the times at night we could smell pork. Like we could smell like we roll them.
Yeah.
When animals are being slaughtered when the pigs. And so I think to myself, how can they live with this? Like, how can they live with the feeling that they're hurting some a living being? And what I think to myself is, I say, and right now I'm thinking, when I'm here, I think of as people who eat as zombies. Because look at it. I know, it might sound weird, but look at it.
Did you all hear this last remark? No. What he said is that people who eat meat are zombies. And then he said, and he started to say something like, "Don't get me wrong." You wanted to explain this. Go ahead.
And I don't want to be offensive or anything, but it's like you're eating yourself. Because look at it. The pigs, they feed the children. The living animals, they need water, they need food. It's like a reflection of humans in a smaller way. But they can't tell you how they feel because they can't talk. And people need to step up to other people who want to bring them down and tell them how the animals feel. Because the animals can say, "Oh, please stop eating me because my race is dying and about to be extinct." You can't say that because they don't know how to.
Do you mind if I ask you? How old are you? You're 10. So I have all this excessive higher education, and I've been a professor for 30 years, and I don't know anything that you didn't just say. It's the truth. And it's very nice that you're able to lay it out that way.
And it's like, really. And so when it makes me start thinking about becoming vegan, like, I don't want to be a part of this anymore, because but every time I hear in the news that there's murders, you never hear murder about an animal. You never hear that because the media doesn't care about it. They don't they like real action news. You know, because they think of animals and God. What news is that?
How do you really? I mean, just you have wisdom beyond your years. Seriously. Thank you. So I'm going to stop now. Thank you very much.